call. So if you're on the call, to make sure you're at the right place. We're going to walk through how to retain tech talent in the US in spite of expiring OPT or failed H-1B lottery. That is an issue that affects a lot of Americans, temporary workers in the US. This presentation was targeted at employers in the US. We also realize there may be a few people who are the immigrant tech worker themselves wondering, what exactly is this? Can this work for me? Can this help me out? If that is you on this call and you're joining this to learn, the goal of this presentation then becomes you would reach out to your manager and say, hey, if there's bad news being delivered, if my OPT is expiring, here's a new option. Reach out to the Syndesus people. Let's talk this through. And if you're a company on this call, we hope this is a presentation that would help you with options on how to keep someone if bad news is delivered via the H-1B lottery, which it delivers bad news every single year. It doesn't matter who the president is of the US. Consistently, it delivers bad news. So let's get started. What we'll do is this event, we'll do an introduction. We'll cover the problem. How can employees work? We'll cover a case study. And then this is always an interesting discussion, Canadian work visa versus US H-1B. We will talk through that. From my perspective as an American citizen who's worked in Silicon Valley for 20 plus years, what I find is most people are very centric on H-1B. They're like, these are my American options. They are not the only options in the world. Conveniently, there's another country just north of us that has great options that we are not aware of. We'll share those, and then we'll help describe how we can help you with this H-1B uncertainty, and then talk, if this sounds good, we'll plow through some next steps. Introductions. Daniel, over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate it. So I am an immigration lawyer based in Toronto, Canada. We've been working with Syndesus for, I don't know how many years now, 7, 8 years.
7 or 8 years.
7 or 8 years we've been working together now. My own experience stretches back beyond that, over a decade, helping companies, foreign workers who are skilled professionals or entrepreneurs with obtaining temporary work permits and permanent residency for both Canada and the United States. So we're familiar with the cross-border strategies, the issues on both sides of the border. I am myself a Canadian immigration lawyer and have members of my team as well, Canadian and US immigration attorneys. And I'm very, very happy to be here today to talk with you about the differences between the US and immigration system and Canada's immigration system, and how Syndesus and this wonderful thing you have going on can really help American companies with bringing their top talent to Canada to continue to work for them. So pleased to be here. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks, Daniel. Quick background on me. American citizen, 20 years in Silicon Valley, worked for 7 VC-backed startups, also lived in Canada. So it's, we always want to, or I always feel it's important to be giving advice on something that I can personally attest to. So I did live in Canada twice. I went on a student visa. I went to Canada's top business school, University of Western Ontario, Ivy School of Business, lived in Ontario for 2 years, went back to Silicon Valley because that's California's home. Ended up boomeranging back to Canada. I was on work visas, worked in venture capital, worked for the tech company in Canada, then came home. So when I started Syndesus in 2014, I started the company basically as a Canadian company that would help US companies hire software engineers in Canada. So basically I was targeting VC-backed companies saying there are amazing software engineers in Canada. That's how we get started. As we got started, it says employer of record. A lot of our US companies came to us and said, thanks for these amazing software engineers. That's wonderful. We need to be able to legally employ them in Canada, and we don't yet have a corporation, and we don't want one. Can you help us? And I'm like, sure. We have an employer of record, which means we can legally employ that worker we just recruited for you. Legal employment means the worker is compliant in Canada. We give them Canadian healthcare. We give them Canadian 401k, which is called RSP. We can facilitate US stock options to a Canadian worker. We can do all of that. Why we started working together 7 years ago is Canada launched a new immigration program, a work visa program called Global Talent Stream. We'll talk about that. And Syndesus became familiar with that. And we, with your help, Daniel, we become experts at that. So we have the focus of this presentation is what we can do using all that knowledge and putting that together. So share this out there for the attendees. These are the four responses we usually see. So every year the US H-1B lottery delivers bad news. And there are so many positions each year, 85,000, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people apply. If you don't get it in 3 years, your OPT runs out and you have to leave the country. So what we see is some companies have told us, yeah, we know how this works. We're going to do the same thing that Google, Meta, Microsoft do. We're going to send them to another country. We're going to send them to our UK, our Ireland office, our Canadian office. We're going to move them around the world. Some people do that. What we see mostly happen for smaller companies is they sadly terminate the worker. There's like, look, we cannot employ you in India, Pakistan, China. It's too far away. The time zones don't work. We're sorry. Mostly terminated. Sometimes they consider opening a subsidiary, but to do it for one or two people, that's too big of a financial ask. And then lastly, they look at transferring the employee to another visa. These are different solutions we've seen put out there. Just want to, in the Q&A, if you have a different suggestion, if you're like, look, here's what our company has done, or here's what we've explored, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. And that's also a reminder, any questions that come up along the way, if you're like, wait a minute, I don't understand what's going on here. Why did you just bring this weird angle up? Put it in the Q&A. What we're going to do at the end is we're going to cover all the questions. We might cover some of them along the way, but anytime a question comes up, put it in the Q&A. We will get to it. So yeah, just for anyone, if you look at these four answers and you're like, yep, those are the solutions that we do, ours is on here. If yours is not, if you have a creative or interesting angle, please feel free to put that in the Q&A. We will address that because we're always curious to know, did we miss something?
And I guess the whole thing of here that we're going to get to is there's another solution. So from the strategies that everyone can see here, we've got something else that people haven't considered if they don't have like a foreign office abroad to move the employee, move them to Canada. And so this is leveling the playing field for those small, medium-sized companies that don't have that.
That's an important distinction, Daniel, because you work with you're a corporate immigration attorney. Also, you work with U.S. and multinationals who are like, look, office India, office U.S., office Canada, got a UK office. The bigger players do this, and they move people around. But if you're a smaller, mid-sized company, that's not in the cards. That's not what you want to do. You're trying to focus on your business. Good Angle Syndesis covers that for you. We could definitely address that and give you all the benefits of that structure without having to set up in multiple places. These four bullets came from our clients being US companies who came to us and said, you're a plan B, or you're the last shot we have a worker's OPT's expired and they lost the H-1B lottery. Help us. We're out of options. We've gone back to these companies and asked, okay, we can, but why is it so important for you to keep this worker? We think we know why it is. Why do you think it is as an American company? First and foremost, no one wants to hear about dollars being the most important thing, but we heard that come up all the time. If we lose an amazing worker and they have to go back to India or Pakistan, China, Taiwan, if they have to go back, we lose them. We have to replace them. We have to recruit someone to replace them. We have to train a new person. All the knowledge in their head for 2-3 years walks away. We lose all of that. Standard replacement cost for a worker is $50,000 to $100,000. That is the conversation we are usually having, where someone will look, every one of our clients will acknowledge all those things. That is a massive cost to bear. They also will mention team morale, productivity. This person was an important part of our team. They contributed. They were bought into our vision. Losing them isn't just their contribution. It also hits other people who say, hey, this person was my teammate, and now they're going to leave and I'm never going to see them again. That's also a hit to the company. Highly skilled worker, if you're in Silicon Valley, Austin, Boston, New York, wherever you are in North America, if someone is highly skilled and a part of your team, it is not easy to replace, nor is it easy to replace what they've learned, the institutional knowledge. You get 2 or 3 years in, this person isn't just an expert on what they know, they become an expert on your team and how things operate. All of that walks out the door. So losing a talented employee, all of these factors add. The one that's not on here, what we'll hear from different HR teams, is when you're part of a team, everyone matters, and you see someone in an impossible situation with immigration, You get personally attached to someone and you watch a system that basically says no matter how talented you are, you will leave the company because your name is not drawn in a lottery. And
Mm.
that's more than morale. That cuts to we're all human and there's people we work with that we care about. And having a system say that person can't stay in the US is devastating.
So Mark, your company also does, HR consulting. So you can speak to with the benefit of keeping that talented employee too. Like I assume that you can just sort of flip some of these things around. Right? Instead of replacement costs are high, they see that a company is spending its money to try to retain its employees. Morale goes up, productivity maybe goes up. Can you talk a little bit about that? I'm just curious because I don't often hear that perspective. I know the doom and gloom story, but the successes, I assume we're going to get into a little bit later. But I'm just curious with the benefits of keeping that talented employee if there isn't an H-1B visa option and you got something else going on. What do you see?
So I'll share both sides. So from an HR perspective, we usually work with HR execs, also sometimes an engineering leader who hired someone on an H-1B. They knew there was a risk that the person was critical to the company. What I've heard from both sides is they talk about I wouldn't just use the morale, I would talk about a personal stress and a personal toll. A comment
Mm,
I heard from someone last week that I met with in San Francisco, her comment to me was, I don't know how someone can handle month after month knowing that if they lose their job or they have to leave, they literally leave in 60 days. They drop everything, sell their car, if they have a home, it all goes and they walk away. Yet their American dream was and you watch them have their American dream destroyed, but the person didn't do anything wrong. So what I've
mm-hmm.
heard consistently from HR people over the years, they're like, Marcus, that person's pain is ours. We feel it too because we're fighting to keep them here. We're paying a good American immigration lawyer. We thought we did everything right, but you still
Right.
face a person and you have to look them in the eye and say, I'm sorry, it didn't work out. So yeah, you can step away from all the economic costs here. There's a personal toll. And so the
Mm.
stress that the worker bears is also bared by their manager and by their HR team who's with them on this journey and then ultimately sits there in the same room with them delivering bad news. But there is but this isn't just a gloom and doom. It's of the dozens and dozens of people we've moved to Canada. I've met many of them. I've gone to we try and have dinners with them, Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver, wherever they're based, in which you get to hear someone saying, "Hey, my scenery changed, but this Canada option turned out fine. Many of the people I meet, they'll already have their Canadian permanent residence. And if they're from India, I'll ask a question, but they know the answer. I'll ask, okay, if you won the H-1B, how long was your wait for a green card in the US? Oh, 35 years, 45, some crazy number. And I'm like, even if you won the H-1B lottery, you still lost. You have no legal right to stay in the US if you lose the job. And so all of them were very clear saying, this immigration system in Canada is much better. I came here on the work visa, but it wasn't just a work visa. I didn't switch one uncertain situation to another. I'm on a better path. So you get to see someone saying, hey, I'm still working, I'm still doing amazing work for this US company. I've still got my dream job, but I'm north of the border. It's a little colder. Maybe in Vancouver, they're like, it rains more, but they're fine. Like I see this in dozens and dozens of cases. It's a better scenario. So it's basically one where both sides win, the employer and the worker.
And I think you're being somewhat modest by saying it turned out fine. I'm typically copied on emails between the HR teams and the workers, and when they get not just their work permit but their permanent residency, there's a lot of exclamation points and congratulations going around. So I think you're being overly modest there. But let's I don't want to take up too much of your time here on that point.
Fair point. It is a huge win, and it does feel good when someone can share with you their story and how life altering it is. It is life altering. This question I float out to I've often I take it back. I haven't often asked this question. This is a bit of a new slide. It's a question I wanted to ask. It's when I've the few HR execs I've got to sit down and I'm like, my first question to them was like, what's the set aside in legal fees for the H-1B lottery and for a green card? They're like 10 to 30,000 per person. And I'm always like, it's not a sure thing, the lottery. They're like, no, what else are you going to do, Mark? And I'm like, okay, thanks for sharing me the monetary amount. That's a lot. That is a lot of money. And what we find out is a lot of the H-1B workers don't know their company's spending this. In fact, it often comes as a shock to them. And our conversation with them is, your company put aside this much resources to keep you. They will put aside tens of thousands more because you are that valuable. You may not know this, but they're not just fighting to keep you with words, they're doing it with deeds and piles of money. But the question becomes, these US companies, is this the only thing you should do? Is if you want to hire highly skilled workers, which is why you use the H-1B lottery to hire the best of the best, should you do it year after year? If you look at what's coming up with Trump 2.0, no one knows what's going to happen. We're going to find out in the first 6 months of next year. But you can be sure there's going to be the uncertainty will continue, because whatever laws are changed, we saw what happened in Trump 1.0. Do you want to be in this position every year? So I want to plant an idea out there to HR execs or engineering. If someone's on the call thinking, yeah, all I know is the H-1B lottery, we'll get to this in a few slides. The question is, what if there was another approach you could do in parallel to the H-1B lottery? Or should you even be doing the H-1B lottery at all? What if you looked at this and said, I could use this Canadian option, maybe I incorporate in Canada, maybe I set up, but it would be less than the amount you're spending per worker here, and the uncertainty will be higher. The H-1B lottery isn't the only way to keep top-tier immigrant talent in North America. There's another option. We're going to get to that.
You just sent chills down my spine, Mark.
Yeah, like there's and what we often hear, what I always hear from HR execs are, I didn't know this existed. All we knew was the lottery. And I'm like, are you a remote company? I'm like, yeah, people don't come in the office. I'm like, but time zone matters? Or like, time zone matters. I'm like, proximity matters? Or like, it does. And I'm like, so you're dumping tens of thousands per person on a lottery in the US? And they're like, yeah, Mark, I didn't know this Canadian option. No one ever shared it with me. That's what we're doing in this presentation. So do you want to continue betting on a lottery, or do you want to look at pursue a long-term strategy where we don't have to deal with US immigration policies? What if you could, I don't know, not to say get around it, but look in a different direction? What we also say what I've heard from countless HR execs I've met in the US, when I explain this option, what they said every single time is, Mark, the only person I talk to about immigration strategy is my immigration lawyer. And what we always say back is, you are probably dealing with a very smart, very driven individual who is an expert in US law. And that person is at the whim of whoever's president and whatever laws get changed. They have no ability to influence them. They can try as hard as they can. They can they can help you write a great file for the lottery. They can try for an O1, but they don't ultimately decide what happens. And that person, what we heard countless times again, is an HR exec or a company exec will say, we were told by our American immigration lawyer there were no other options. What you didn't hear was there were no other American options. There is another way to do this. What's possible with American laws is not the only answer. And especially with new administration coming in, it's in your best interest to look at other options. And if your American lawyer can't help you, they're your go-to. We're offering you an alternative of when that doesn't work out, or here's what you should do in parallel. Not to discount an American immigration lawyer. You're probably dealing with a professional, but they only know what's possible in the US. And here's what we find the employees are doing. There's probably some employees on this call. We get people on H-1B who are trying to get an H-1B coming to us all the time, booking calls because they saw a webinar. They're trying to figure out, is there another option? What else can I do? Are there other work visas I can do in the US? Could I work remotely from Canada? So while what we find is their HR manager or their engineering leader doesn't know options exist, your worker at midnight, they're the ones Googling solutions saying, how can I possibly keep my American dream alive when the US immigration system's about to let me down? So they're doing this research and they're open to these ideas. Again, it comes back to the US employer. These are possible, but you're the one that's going to have to make the decision on, is this a viable option and how it works?
And I can tell you just anecdotally, Mark, as well, that's who's contacting our law firm. They're high-skilled, high-tech workers who are in temporary status in the United States. If you look at the immigration statistics, country of origin, you got India and China, but country where they were last resident, very high numbers are coming from the United States. This is exactly what's happening. And employers should be at least aware that they're competing with that. The workers are facing this uncertainty, even if they get the H-1B. I think that's something that you were getting to before. They're still
Yes.
looking at Canada. They're using that work experience in the US and saying, wait a second, how can I settle myself down? How can I settle my family down? That stress level you talked about before is so high. And the entire team is feeling it. Winning a lottery to put you in a line for 30 years, I don't know how that reduces the stress. That just perpetuates it. So that's the feedback we're receiving from the individual workers when they contact us. Um, so I think this case study by Retail Next and what we managed to do together is absolutely great.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. You're seeing the inquiries, and I think as we talked, you said due to the U.S. election, those inquiries only went up dramatically. So yeah, you get to see it.
Mm-hmm.
And Retail Next, VC-backed company, Silicon Valley, been using the H-1B lottery for years. Hire the best of the best, just like many U.S. companies. We'll talk about their specific situation. Sorry, we'll skip forward. So it's tech company, um, significant engineering team. They they had often used, I think, in the 10 years to 11 years they've been in operation, used the lottery consistently. It's a typical Silicon Valley VC-backed company. You're going to use the lottery to get to hire amazing people. You get the best lawyers you can, and ultimately, sometimes things don't work out. We've worked with them. We've moved 3 people to Canada over the years. Over time, they try with the lottery first. We are the fallback. If it doesn't work out, they come to us. Move a person to Canada. Again, we're always there as an option. That's how some companies look at us. It's the fallback. What we're trying to introduce the idea is that's great. We're always there for that. But what if it became the go-to as opposed to the fallback? Is it a better economic decision? Again, we leave that to companies. We want to make them aware. These are the numbers I got from the HR exec, VP of People, Andrew Golden at Retail Next. I'm like, you had to do the math. You couldn't just come to us and move people to Canada. You had to make the case internally. How did you make the case internally? What are the numbers? What are your numbers? So his number was 60 to 70,000 of lost productivity. If they had terminated the worker and they had to go back to home country. They also shared that there's a lack of confidence in hiring people in the U.S. market without using the lottery. They're doing very specific work around computer vision, very, very technical work. There wasn't a big enough pool. They're like, of course we have to use the lottery. We hear this time and time again from U.S. companies. What they did in the past is they terminated the worker. You use the lottery, your OPT is expiring. I'm sorry, we will have to terminate your employment. You'll be returning to home country. Their comment to us was, no one pulled us aside and said Canada's an option. All we were told is, here's the U.S. immigration options, done. That isn't the case for them anymore. Again, we've moved 3 people to Canada over the last 3 years. And additionally, they shared with us, as with any small company, you lose someone on your team, it affects your product cycle, it affects your roadmap, it affects your revenue plans. Being a VC-backed tech company, every company faces this. You have a team of technical people because they're working on your product. There's release dates. You take someone out of it who's critical, it's going to have a hit to revenue along the way, and it's going to have a direct effect on your customers. All that's very clear. When you hear that, you're like, it's obvious retaining the person is a good strategy, is important to your company for all these reasons and many more. So let's get very specific. If you're like, okay, that's great. You might be thinking we do use the lottery. You might be thinking we're worried about change in policy going forward. It's bad enough already. Is it going to get worse? Is it going to stay the same? You might be a tech worker thinking, this is me. This lottery coming up in April is my last chance. What we do is we schedule a call first with the worker, with Daniel and his team, qualify them for moving to Canada. First step is, do you qualify? Daniel handles that. I think, Daniel, these phone calls are 1 or 2 hours. You have an answer back within 24, 48 hours, or
Yeah,
on the
actually,
call.
the call with the workers, maybe 30 minutes, 45 minutes, to be honest. We do a little bit of work beyond that when we're doing researching the case, making sure that the position and the wages and everything qualifies. And our goal is to get a reply back within, yeah, 1 to 2 business days, so that way everyone knows this is a case that we can proceed with or not. So that's a fair, accurate
It's
timeline.
very fast.
Yeah.
That's the first step. Then the worker comes back. They can go to their manager and say, I qualify. I qualify for this work visa. Can we do this? Have a conversation with the company. Then we facilitated moving the foreign national to work remotely, permanently from Canada, onboarded them. For example, we have a webinar every month. You're moving to Canada. I went through this twice when I moved up there, both on student visas and work visas. How to get a bank account, how to get a Canadian Social Security card, how to find your first apartment or house, how does Canadian healthcare work, where do I get, what mobile company do I work with? Everything changes when you cross the border. We walk people through every month through a quick webinar of here's how to move. So we make the move easy for them. Then since Indis is an employer of record in Canada, we legally hire them. And then they are basically working remotely from Canada, legally for Syndesis, which is a Canadian corporation. So this is how we help them. This is how we can help any US company or person.
So same project, no interruption to what the work that they have been doing in the United States, other than picking up your laptop, moving to Canada, onboarding, and they're good to go for. Just so people know, it's a 3-year working permit that we start them out with, and usually there's a path to permanent residency within that time. So it's a really smooth transition from the immigration perspective, and it sounds like it's pretty smooth from the HR and onboarding perspective with Syndesis.
Yeah, this is Daniel's exactly what we do. We have allotted spots from Canadian government for Global Talent Stream. We've been doing this since 2017. We are the legal employer in Canada, not a contractor. We only hire people as employees. We follow all the Canadian rules. A lot of companies come to us and say, we don't have an entity in Canada. We can't play that game like the big tech companies, Salesforce and Oracle, all those have companies. We're like, we know, don't worry. We are a Canadian company. We do have employer of record. We know Canadian laws. We can know Canadian HR. We know Canadian rules. We know Canadian immigration. We have experts, access to experts like you, Daniel. We handle everything in Canada. That's what an employer of record, that's what we do. And people are like, well, how do I pay the worker? And we're like, workers like to get paid twice a week, direct deposit into their bank accounts, net of all taxes. They would like to know that their taxes are submitted to the government and that the employer probably wants to know the taxes are submitted. We do the same thing in Canada. If a company, US company comes to us and says, okay, look, it's not just 1 or 2 people, Mark, this sounds great. Maybe we should establish in Canada and we should have 5, 10, 20 people up there. And what if we didn't use the lottery? Our response would be like, that's wonderful. We'll show you how to set up. We'll connect you with Daniel. We'll teach you how to do this as a US company which sets up a Canadian operation. You want to use that Syndesis for 1 or 2 or 3? Wonderful. You want to scale this? We'll teach you how. Either way, no, it's your choice. You don't have to set up a Canadian corporation. We got you, but if you want to, it might be
Mm.
a good idea to take away the volatility of worrying about the US H-1B lottery year after year and wondering, can I get access to top tier tech talent when I see a president coming in and I'm like, what's going to happen? Why deal with the uncertainty? So yeah, I mentioned Canadian HR, healthcare, 401k, all those things. We facilitate that. Stock options too. All can be handled. And so, who can we help? The situation where what we mostly see is someone on OPT not selected and has to leave the U.S. Last option. We've also moved a few people up who came to us and said, as you pointed this out earlier, I'm on a 30 to 50 year wait for a green card. And they had a sympathetic US employee who said that, okay, we helped you get the H-1B lottery. You're not going to get a green card. Okay, 30 to 50 years? It's crazy. Hey,
Hmm.
Syndesis can get you, we can work with them to get you to Canada. Well, then your Canadian green card, permanent residence, is a whole lot faster. We've helped people move for that reason. The third angle is this is the one we're seeing more often. A company with an office, for example, in the US and India, or US and China, will come to us and say, L1's not an option. And our team always pushes back and says, why not? Like, this is common. You move people in on L1, your American immigration lawyer should have walked you through it. The use case we're hearing is that doesn't allow for the worker to stay long term. That is a temporary situation. They leave. There's not a good path to a green card. And then the use case we're hearing more often is we want to bring a worker over from India. We want them to stay, and we can't give them the US dream. But we understand in Canada, there's a faster path to a
Right.
work visa. They can get permanent residence. They can be a citizen maybe in 5 years. That is something we can give to the best workers, keeps them with us as a company. That
Yeah.
that use case, Daniel, I'm seeing more of where it's someone extremely talented. And at some point, we ask the question, but we know what the answer is. They're like, L1ing them or moving them on a transfer visa to the US is not the answer. It doesn't give us
Right.
what we want or what the worker wants.
It gives them up to 5 years as a specialized knowledge worker on an L1B in the US. And while the company can certainly, take a look at options to petition for an EB2 or EB3 as well for that worker, because the wait times are so long, that 5 years is only a fraction of the time it's going to take them to get a green card. And so the question then becomes, what do you do? After the 5 years, you have to transfer them back to India. And so the solutions that we've traditionally, before we had GTS, a lot of companies would set up an operation in Canada, put the worker in Canada for a year. Hey, while they're there, maybe apply for PR. Technically, after a year in Canada and an affiliated company, they could send them back to the US. And so you had this back and forth. And that's what a lot of the big companies did for years until we had this GTS option that came up. And happy to go into that on the next slide. But you're quite right. The options for the US don't provide the long-term certainty that an employer needs or the worker needs for L visas. And then strangely enough, H-1B sort of gives them, I guess, kind of that certainty. I don't know. Once you win the lottery, you're there. You win the lottery, you petition, and then that person and their green card is going to be 30 years away. And I want to dive into that one too. How even though the individual can keep looking and applying for an H-1B extension, it's actually not as long term of a solution as a lot of people think. And so I can go into that as well and sort of tease that out and see why Canada may be even better for keeping that employee.
Yeah, I think that's going to be our next to last slide. We'll talk about US H-1B and Canadian work visa side by side. I'll make one more point on this third one. We also have companies coming to us. Again, a surprise. I want to ask for, what's the use case? You have offices in the US, you got a team in India, and they're moving a tech worker to the US. I'm like, why Canada? And the more and more popular use case is, well, Mark, time zone matters. We have development going on in India, but we have people who need to work in the time zone with their US clients or work same time zone as a US team. And I'm like, and staying up all night's not ideal, or having your team wake up at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. to do calls. They're like, no, actually, it does matter. We can't get this person in the US. Canada has amazing immigration. We're going to work with you to bring this person to Canada. I'm like, all fine. Any of these situations work. But if you could sum them up, what you're also going to see is they're addressing the uncertainty of what US immigration is now, what US immigration work visa policy is now and has been for decades. There have been no major changes to the H-1B program in decades. Any US company at this point should know what they get. We're trying to open their eyes to there's other options up north. Really quickly, over to you, Daniel. Canada has their global talent stream. It's Canada's H-1B for a better option, but over to you to walk through the difference between both programs because you're very familiar with each.
Yeah, so on the US side, I'm sure your audience is very familiar. Nothing there seems to be too radically stated. You have to win a lottery. The odds of actually winning that lottery vary year to year. 15 to 30% is the the range that we've seen over the last number of years. What people don't really know from those statistics really is who wins the lottery and how often. And so the H-1B lottery system is actually weighted towards bigger companies. They have a larger workforce and a larger capacity to submit more balls into the lottery. And so they're more often winning. And you can see the H-1B lottery is dominated by a handful of companies, right? And so you look at that and say, wait, those same large companies also have the ability to move workers around the world by intracorporately transferring them to their different subsidiaries. This whole thing seems weighted against it's weighted in favor of the large companies and weighted against small, medium-sized businesses, well-funded, VC-backed, few hundred employees, maybe 1,000 employees. They just don't necessarily, they can't compete with the the monsters of the tech world who've got 30, 40,000 employees in the United States who could put in all those lottery spots. There's one or two or three, or even the tech services companies who really dominate that space. In contrast, for Canada, it's not weighted toward anybody as long as your company has can demonstrate a need, and you're a growing company like Syndesis. You don't have to be a Goliath, but you can get a worker on a work permit for Canada, and you don't have to win a lottery to do it. You can do it 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We can submit an application. It's pretty quick. The government does have a processing target of processing the global talent stream approvals. That is the initial position approval in 2 weeks or less, and secondarily the work visa, about 2 weeks from the time they do biometrics, so about 3 weeks. Our government isn't meeting those targets these days, so I think these numbers here, 30 to 60 days, is probably closer to the reality. The government was very ambitious, and we met those numbers for a long time, the quicker processing time. So it can be fast, but still these timelines, should be music to somebody's ears if they're comparing it to the US system. The costs much lower. It's not as complex, it's not as chance driven. And when you have something that in the US, you have to win a lottery to earn or win, not even earn it, but because there's just fewer spots available in the marketplace, there's shorter supply, so the price is higher. Whereas in Canada, it's open to anybody anytime. It's a different marketplace. Costs and fees paid by employers are a lot lower. And the time to then get permanent residency doesn't even compare in a lot of cases for workers who are from India or China. It's Canada doesn't have at the moment restrictions based on somebody's country of origin that you do in the U.S. And the U.S. has had that for so long that they won't accept more than 7.5% of all permanent residency admissions under the employment-based preference categories from any one country of origin. So what happens over time is when the pool of candidates represents 15%, but you only accept 7.5, and now something that would have taken a year to process is now not going to get touched for another year. It's still submitted, but now and then next year, same crop of candidates apply and for that group, well, now they have a year that's already in, that's waiting, plus another cohort who's also submitted that year, and then they got to wait another year. So we went from 1, 2, 3, 4, quickly cascading over time to what we're seeing now in the US, 30 plus years after the employers actually petitioned for permanent residency. And I think that's important. You have the situation in Canada where the worker applies for permanent residency based on certain factors. They can do that sometimes right away when we get the global talent stream approval. Sometimes they have to work in Canada for a year, but once they do, it takes about 6 months to process the permanent application. I think the 8 to 12 months, I was speaking about lead times almost than anything else. So it's very fast to get permanent residency in Canada. And then another thing that makes Canada different than the US is you can apply for permanent citizenship a lot sooner, right? Even after acquiring a green card in the US, I don't know, 40 years from now, you then have to wait another 5 years after being an American for all intents and purposes for that entire period of time, another 5 years. Canada's pretty fast. We actually, in Canada, they give you partial credit for time spent as a temporary resident towards your citizenship application, which is something the US doesn't do. So if you've been in Canada for a year or 2 years, you get 50% credit up to a maximum of 1 year towards the minimum 3 year requirement. That's why it's a sort of a range. But you don't have to be in Canada for 5 years before you apply for citizenship. And you don't have to be in Canada for even 3 years as a permanent resident. You have to accumulate the equivalent of 3 years of physical presence in Canada, and you get partial credit for that time spent in temporary residency. So that 5 years is like from the day that we speak to the candidate while they're in the United States to when they have a Canadian passport in hand. I think that's a key distinction. Whereas here in the US, no. Once you're in the US and on a green card, 5 years later. So there's a big difference there. Something else I just wanted to piggyback on something you were saying before regarding the long wait times and when we were talking about the L-1B and why a lot of employers were not in favor of it because it gives them a 5 year solution. It doesn't give them the long-term solution. They know that worker is going to have to go abroad. They know that it's a long time to get a green card and they need a solution there. So for that particular case scenario, I want to just highlight something about the H-1B program that a lot of employers maybe miss, or maybe their counsel hasn't really delved in on. And they will only know this from experience of having happened to them, right? So the first thing is, yes, when you have an H-1B approval and you apply employer petitions for employment-based preference category 2 or 3 and submit, the I-140, the worker gets their priority date. They can then apply for a renewal of that H-1B and do it every year. What happened during the Trump administration, 2017 to 2021, was that they introduced a new rule, and it was that officers wouldn't defer to the decision made by an officer in a previous H-1B application. So what that means is it used to be kind of routine to get that renewal. Same employer, same position, it was specialized and everything. Nothing's really changed about it. Maybe the wages went up, but it's the same rule. So therefore, why would an officer have to re-adjudicate it? So they changed it. And what we saw was a ton of re-adjudication. And lawyers in my office were dealing with requests for evidence and refusals and people scrambling and coming to us to help them out. They say, oh, it was routine. We just filed it. We didn't think it was such a big deal. So they're coming to us for assistance. Maybe they're coming to us for Canadian visa help for the worker. But that rule, that didn't go anywhere, right? So it's sort of relaxed now a little bit. But I do see, I don't have any reason to believe, when January comes around, some of the tougher interpretations that were in place before, I don't see any reason why they wouldn't come back. At least in full force. A lot of counsel and companies did that, but it caught people by surprise. And so something like that could happen again. And the second thing that really catches employers by surprise is something called the portability of H-1Bs, right? And that is a little bit bizarre. They said, wait a second, we won the lottery, we petitioned for the green card, and now the worker gets a job offer from another company. They can just leave? Yeah. All the other company has to do is put in a petition to port the H-1B over. That doesn't even mean, just so we're clear, they don't have to wait until even it's approved. Once they file it, that worker's gone. And so you thought you invested in a strategy that had a pathway to permanent residency and that worker was tethered to you. That's not the case. For about 20 years, we've had this portability provision. It seems like a lot of employers are still caught by surprise. A lot of them were caught by surprise by the small, medium-sized employers who don't have a history of winning H-1B lotteries because the system's been weighted against them for so many years. Well, they're newer companies and they're just not aware of it. The big companies are aware, and yeah, it's part of the bleed. And they often lose people to each other, so they're being poached. So when I have an employee come to us and we're talking about their visa options for Canada, and I'm speaking to somebody who has an H-1B, and they're really hesitant to approach their employer about asking if they can move to Canada and continue to do the work, right? I said, wait a second, you realize you're holding the golden ticket. Your H-1B is now portable, right? What does that mean? It means that you can go work for anybody in the US tomorrow, and there's nothing that they can do about it. Why are you scared? You hold all of the cards, all the positions, and I just want, the audience. I know it's a corporate audience. We're targeting employers. They have to understand the mentality of the worker and what advice they're getting from Canadian Immigration Council or U.S. Immigration Council, right? Because we're aware of this, right? That
Yeah.
worker can go somewhere else. Oh, well, if I can do that, then I don't know my employer all that much, and maybe I shouldn't be so scared. And so we say to them, look, don't be so scared to ask your employer now if you can move your job to Canada because you want to stay employed with the same company, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the other mentality is they could just go and get a job with another U.S. employer. And I tell them, look, if your employer says no, remind them that before you do this, go look for some other jobs with other U.S. employers. Just that, right? And have that conversation with them. Yes, I have an H-1B. Yes, it can be ported over. You go for some interviews, get some interest, and say, but really, I don't want to be in the U.S. Do you think you'd help support my relocation to Canada? I know this great company, Synthesis, that can help make that happen, right? So I've had these scenarios come up before, and suddenly they feel empowered, not knowing that they were empowered from the beginning. And because there are about 500,000 unfilled high-skilled technical jobs open in the United States right now, and only 65,000 general lottery spots per year, another 20,000 if you throw in the master's graduates. It's such a small fraction that anybody who already has an H-1B, right? They don't realize how much power that they possess until they speak to a lawyer or they read some things online, and everything turns around. So if you're an employer, you don't want to be caught by that. If somebody comes to you, you have people in your workforce who are on H-1Bs and maybe they have their I-140s and they're just waiting for that green card, because the priority date's so long from now. You don't have any certainty, right? You have actually a worker who can leave at any moment, but it is probably getting solicited and offers from large companies, right? And you and I both know this, Mark, too. These databases are open to the public. You can find out what companies have won and filed LCAs and won H-1Bs. We know, right? It's not so hard. You go to a small, medium-sized company. It's public information, right? And that's the environment that small, medium-sized employers are working in. The big tech companies, they can look this up. Recruitment companies, they do this. They look it up. They know who has an H-1B, right? They can go to LinkedIn. They go in, they go after them, and you're going to lose that worker. Or you say, you know what? We're going to reward that person's productivity. We're going to reward their loyalty. We're going to consider this move to Canada. They're still going to hold on to the priority date for a green card. They're just going to move to Canada for a few years, get their Canadian work permit, get their permanent residency, get their citizenship, and they can still hold on to that priority date to the U.S. It's a win-win. They didn't give up their job. They didn't give up any opportunities. They got stability. You have now stability. You have a more loyal employee. If that person's going to leave you in Canada once a permanent resident, they could have left you in the United States while on an H-1B. That's basically the point.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
Dennis, I just want to interrupt you real quick. I know we're down to about 5 minutes before the top of the hour. You are making a strong case for people to be aware of what are the limitations of the US system and what benefits you get from utilizing the Canadian system, however you choose to do so. You're moving your people using Synthesis, establishing a corporation in Canada and taking advantage of Canadian immigration. There are definite advantages. This is our last slide. If anyone has questions, reach out. I'm going to quickly go through some of the questions. Mohammed had a few questions. I think current student in the US doing masters.